Picture this. You're an Allied soldier advancing through a war-torn European city in 1944. The rubble-strewn streets echo with distant gunfire. Suddenly, your commanding officer receives an urgent radio transmission. Intelligence reports that a Sturmtiger has been spotted in your sector. The reaction is immediate. Orders are given to halt the advance, call in air support, and under no circumstances engage this mechanical monster directly. What kind of weapon could strike such fear into battle-hardened veterans who had already faced the formidable Tiger and Panther tanks? What made this particular German war machine so terrifying that Allied commanders would rather retreat than face it head-on? Today, we're diving deep into the story of the Sturmtiger, officially known as the Sturmpanzer VI. This was the tank that the Allies avoided at all costs, a 65-ton fortress destroyer that could level entire city blocks with a single shot. This is the story of Nazi Germany's most devastating urban assault weapon, a vehicle so powerful and so feared that its mere presence could change the course of a battle. To understand why the Sturmtiger was so revolutionary and so terrifying, we need to step back and look at how the concept of assault guns evolved during World War II. When tanks first rolled onto the battlefields of World War I, their primary purpose was straightforward: break through heavily fortified enemy positions. These early armored vehicles were designed to cross trenches, crush barbed wire, and shield infantry from machine gun fire as they advanced across no man's land. The tank was, fundamentally, a mobile bunker designed to crack open static defensive positions. The American Renault FT tanks demonstrated this perfectly during the Meuse-Argonne offensive, where they proved instrumental in overcoming the fortified German positions across the Saint-Mihiel salient. These small but revolutionary tanks could approach enemy bunkers and trenches with relative impunity, providing the firepower needed to break the stalemate of trench warfare. But as the interwar years progressed and military doctrine evolved, the role of tanks began to shift dramatically. The Germans, in particular, revolutionized armored warfare with their concept of blitzkrieg, or lightning war. In this new doctrine, tanks weren't just bunker busters. They became the spearhead of rapid mobile warfare, designed to penetrate deep into enemy territory, encircle opposing forces, and create chaos in the rear areas. By the time World War II erupted in 1939, tank-on-tank combat had become increasingly common. The primary role of armored vehicles shifted from destroying fortifications to engaging enemy armor and supporting infantry in mobile operations. Tank designers focused on creating vehicles with better guns, faster speeds, and more reliable mechanical systems to excel in these fluid, dynamic battles. However, as the war progressed and the Germans found themselves fighting in heavily urbanized areas, particularly on the Eastern Front, a critical gap emerged in their arsenal. The standard panzer divisions, optimized for mobile warfare across open terrain, struggled in dense urban environments. Cities like Stalingrad became nightmarish battlegrounds where German tanks found themselves vulnerable to infantry attacks from buildings and unable to effectively neutralize heavily fortified positions. The German military establishment recognized that they needed to resurrect the original purpose of the tank, a specialized vehicle capable of obliterating even the most robust fortifications. But this time, they would take the concept to an extreme that had never been seen before. They needed something that could demolish reinforced bunkers, level fortified buildings, and clear entire city blocks to support their infantry. They needed a modern siege weapon for urban warfare. The solution was conceptually simple, but mechanically audacious. Take the largest, most powerful gun you can find and mount it on the most heavily armored chassis available. The result would be a class of vehicles known as assault guns or assault mortars, and the Sturmtiger would become the most extreme and terrifying example of this concept ever produced. The story of the Sturmtiger begins not on the battlefield, but in the naval shipyards of Germany. Its main weapon, the 380mm Raketenwerfer 61, or RW-61 rocket launcher, was originally designed for an entirely different purpose. As a depth-charge launcher for the Kriegsmarine, Germany's naval forces. This massive naval weapon was designed to launch depth charges against submarines, using a rocket-assisted system to propel the charges to greater distances than traditional launchers. It was a specialized naval weapon that seemed to have little application on land. But German military engineers, always looking for innovative solutions to tactical problems, saw potential in this oversized launcher. In 1943, as the tide of war was beginning to turn against Germany, the German High Command commissioned a study to determine if this naval weapon could be adapted for land warfare. The idea was audacious. Could this massive rocket launcher be mounted on a tank chassis to create the ultimate bunker-busting assault gun? The project was assigned to the firm of Alket, which had experience producing assault guns and self-propelled artillery. The engineers faced a monumental challenge. The RW-61 was enormous, and finding a chassis that could support its weight, absorb its recoil, and still remain mobile was no simple task. The solution was to use the chassis of Germany's most famous heavy tank, the Tiger I. The Tiger I was already legendary on the battlefield. Its combination of heavy armor, powerful gun, and reliable engineering made it one of the most feared tanks of the war. By 1943, however, many Tiger I tanks had been damaged in combat or suffered mechanical breakdowns. These damaged vehicles provided the perfect foundation for the new assault gun. The conversion process was extensive. The Tiger I's famous 80mm gun and its rotating turret were removed entirely. In their place, engineers constructed a massive fixed casemate superstructure on top of the chassis. This box-like structure would house the enormous 380mm rocket launcher, the crew, and the ammunition. The transformation changed the vehicle's appearance dramatically. Where the Tiger I had a certain brutal elegance with its cylindrical turret and long gun barrel, the Sturmtiger looked almost comical at first glance. Its stubby, short barrel mounted in an oversized, boxy superstructure gave it the appearance of a child's toy that had been scaled up to monstrous proportions. Some Allied soldiers who first encountered it reportedly laughed at its appearance until they witnessed what it could do. The official designation was Sturmpanzer IV Sturmtiger, though it was also known by several other names, including Sturmpanzer Tiger or Assault Mortar Tiger. Production orders were issued in August 1944, with Alket tasked to convert 18 Tiger I chassis into Sturmtigers. Eventually, the production run would reach a total of only 18 vehicles, making it one of the rarest German armored vehicles of the war. By September 1944, the first Sturmtigers were rolling off the production line. Each vehicle represented a massive investment of resources and skilled labor, which Germany could increasingly ill afford. But German commanders believed these vehicles would be worth the cost, providing a decisive advantage in the brutal urban warfare that characterized the final years of the conflict. The Sturmtiger stood over 10 feet tall, stretched nearly 21 feet in length, and weighed a colossal 65 tons when fully loaded. It was a behemoth that announced its presence with every rumbling movement of its tracks. But size and weight were just the beginning of what made this vehicle so formidable. At the heart of the Sturmtiger's fearsome reputation was its main armament, the 380mm Raketenwerfer 61L 5.4 rocket launcher. To put that measurement in perspective, 380 millimeters equals nearly 15 inches in diameter. This made it one of the largest caliber weapons ever mounted on an armored fighting vehicle. The projectiles fired by this monster were equally impressive. Each rocket-propelled mortar shell weighed approximately 761 pounds, or 345 kilograms. To understand just how massive these shells were, consider that a standard artillery shell fired by the American M1 howitzer weighed around 95 pounds. The Sturmtiger's ammunition was 8 times heavier. But the real innovation wasn't just in the size of the projectile. It was in how that projectile was launched. The weapon system used a sophisticated two-stage rocket propulsion system that was revolutionary for its time. Here's how it worked. When the crew fired the weapon, a small primary charge would detonate first. This initial explosion was just powerful enough to expel the massive projectile from the barrel, pushing it clear of the vehicle. This stage was critical because it meant the projectile could safely clear the short barrel without requiring an enormous initial explosion inside the confined space of the gun chamber. Once the projectile was airborne and clear of the vehicle, the second stage would activate. A solid-fuel rocket motor built into the base of the projectile would ignite, dramatically accelerating the shell toward its target. This two-stage system allowed the Sturmtiger to launch incredibly heavy projectiles to distances that would have been impossible with conventional artillery of the same caliber. The maximum effective range of the Sturmtiger was approximately 6,000 meters, or roughly 3.7 miles. While this might not seem particularly impressive compared to conventional long-range artillery, remember that the Sturmtiger wasn't designed for artillery duels. It was designed for direct fire against fortified positions at close to medium range in urban environments. The projectiles came in several varieties, each designed for specific tactical situations. The most common was the high-explosive round designed for demolishing fortifications. This shell could penetrate up to 2.5 meters of reinforced concrete. That's over 8 feet of some of the strongest defensive material available. Bunkers that could withstand repeated hits from conventional artillery would simply cease to exist after a direct hit from a Sturmtiger. There was also a shape-charge version designed specifically for penetrating heavy armor, though this was less commonly used since the Sturmtiger rarely engaged enemy tanks directly. Additionally, there were experimental incendiary rounds designed to create firestorms in urban areas, though the use of these in actual combat remains poorly documented. When a Sturmtiger shell hit a building, the results were catastrophic. The massive explosive force would not only destroy the structure itself, but would also create a shockwave powerful enough to cause severe structural damage to adjacent buildings. In densely packed urban areas, a single well-placed shot could effectively level an entire city block. Witnesses to Sturmtiger attacks described the effect as apocalyptic. The ground would shake as if from an earthquake. A massive explosion would send debris flying hundreds of feet into the air. Concrete and steel that had withstood years of conventional bombardment would simply disintegrate. For troops sheltering in what they thought were safe positions, a Sturmtiger attack meant there was nowhere to hide. The psychological impact was almost as significant as the physical destruction. Soldiers who survived an attack by a Sturmtiger described a feeling of complete helplessness. There was no defense against it. No building was safe. No fortification was strong enough. The mere knowledge that a Sturmtiger was operating in the area was enough to severely impact morale and combat effectiveness. But this devastating firepower came with significant limitations and complications, problems that would ultimately prevent the Sturmtiger from achieving its full potential on the battlefield. As with many of Germany's late-war wonder weapons, the Sturmtiger's incredible firepower came at a steep operational cost. The vehicle's limitations were as extreme as its capabilities, and these shortcomings would significantly impact its effectiveness in combat. The most obvious limitation was ammunition capacity. Due to the enormous size and weight of each projectile, the Sturmtiger could carry a maximum of only 14 rounds. In practice, most vehicles went into combat with just 13 rounds, keeping 1 in the breech and 12 stored in the fighting compartment. For comparison, a standard Sherman tank could carry between 70 and 90 rounds of 75mm ammunition. A Tiger I could carry 92 rounds of 88mm shells. But the Sturmtiger crew had to make every single shot count, because after just over a dozen shots, their massive gun became nothing more than dead weight. The reloading process was another significant challenge. Loading a 761-pound projectile into a vertical breech was not something that could be done quickly or easily. It required the coordinated effort of all available crew members, typically 4 men, working with a specialized loading crane mounted on the rear deck of the vehicle. An experienced, well-trained crew could complete the reloading process in approximately 10 minutes under ideal conditions. But on the battlefield, under fire, with the stress of combat, reloading could take considerably longer. This meant that the Sturmtiger essentially had no capability for sustained fire. It would shoot once, then the crew would have to decide whether to attempt a dangerous reload under combat conditions or relocate to a safer position. In practice, standard operating procedure was to fire one shot, immediately relocate to a different firing position, and then reload. This made the Sturmtiger more like a sniper than conventional artillery, carefully choosing targets and timing shots for maximum effect, rather than laying down sustained fire. But perhaps the most significant operational challenge was the firing signature. When a Sturmtiger fired, it created a spectacle that could be seen and heard for miles. The 2-stage rocket propulsion system was partly to blame. Remember that first-stage charge that expelled the projectile from the barrel? That explosion created a massive amount of gas and pressure inside the gun chamber. This gas couldn't be vented into the crew compartment because it would poison the operators with toxic fumes. But it also couldn't be simply contained in the barrel because the pressure was so immense it risked rupturing the gun or even causing a catastrophic explosion. German engineers solved this problem with an innovative but problematic solution. They fitted the barrel with a series of small perforations arranged in a ring around the main barrel opening. These holes, covered by a protective cap during transport and combat, would be opened during firing. As the first-stage charge detonated, the gases would be redirected through these perforations, venting the pressure safely away from both the crew and the gun mechanism. The result was visually spectacular but tactically disastrous. When the Sturmtiger fired, jets of flame and smoke would blast out from these ports, creating a distinctive flower-like pattern of fire around the barrel. This was immediately followed by the massive plume of smoke and flame from the second-stage rocket motor igniting. The combined effect created a fireball that could be seen from miles away, essentially announcing to every enemy unit in the area exactly where the Sturmtiger was located. In an era where artillery spotting and counter-battery fire were highly developed, this was extremely dangerous. Enemy artillery could quickly zero in on the Sturmtiger's position. Allied fighter-bombers, which dominated the skies by 1944, would be called in to attack the vehicle. Even infantry units with anti-tank weapons would know exactly where to focus their efforts. This limitation meant that Sturmtiger tactics revolved around firing a single shot and then immediately relocating before enemy forces could respond. Crews would carefully select their firing positions with multiple escape routes planned in advance. They would fire, then retreat to a hidden position where the vehicle could be reloaded in relative safety before moving to an entirely different firing position for the next shot. The tactical doctrine that developed around the Sturmtiger was almost more akin to guerrilla warfare than conventional armored operations. Hit hard, disappear, reload, reposition, and strike again from an unexpected direction. For a 65-ton vehicle, this was easier said than done. While the Sturmtiger's firepower was compromised by significant operational limitations, its defensive capabilities were truly exceptional. The vehicle was designed from the ground up to survive in the most dangerous environments imaginable. Close-range urban combat where enemy infantry could approach from any direction, and anti-tank weapons could be fired from point-blank range. The Sturmtiger's armor protection was built around the proven Tigerwing chassis, but with significant upgrades. The design philosophy was simple: make it so heavily armored that enemy weapons simply couldn't penetrate it. The frontal armor was the most impressive aspect. The front glacis plate, which was sloped at an optimal angle for deflecting incoming rounds, was a massive 150 millimeters thick. To put that in perspective, this was 50% thicker than the already formidable 100mm frontal armor of the standard Tiger I tank. This made the Sturmtiger's frontal armor among the thickest of any production armored vehicle in World War II. The sloped design was critical. By angling the armor plate, incoming projectiles would be more likely to deflect off the surface rather than penetrate it. Even if a round hit perfectly square and didn't deflect, it would have to punch through what was effectively even more armor due to the angle of impact. Enemy gunners would find that shots that should theoretically penetrate would bounce off harmlessly. The side armor was also impressive, ranging from 80 to 100 millimeters depending on the location. The rear armor, typically the weakest point on any armored vehicle, was still a respectable 80 millimeters. The top armor, designed to protect against artillery airbursts and attacks from above, was 40 millimeters thick. This armor configuration made the Sturmtiger nearly invulnerable to most Allied anti-tank weapons of the time. The standard American 57mm anti-tank gun, which equipped many infantry units, could not penetrate the Sturmtiger from any angle at any practical combat range. The British 6-pounder anti-tank gun faced the same problem. Even the famous Soviet T-34 medium tank, the workhorse of the Red Army, struggled against the Sturmtiger. The T-34's 76.2mm gun could not reliably penetrate the frontal armor even at close range. It would take the upgraded T-34-85 with its more powerful 85mm gun to have any realistic chance of penetrating the Sturmtiger's armor, and even then, only with a lucky shot to a weak point. The American Sherman tank, which made up the bulk of Allied armor in Western Europe, was similarly outmatched. The standard 75mm gun on most Sherman variants could not penetrate the Sturmtiger's frontal armor. Even the upgraded Sherman Firefly, with its powerful 17-pounder gun, would struggle against the Sturmtiger's thick armor plates. This meant that attacking a Sturmtiger required either very heavy anti-tank guns, which were relatively rare and difficult to maneuver, or attacks from the air. Allied commanders quickly learned that the best way to deal with a Sturmtiger was to call in air support rather than try to engage it with ground forces. For crew protection at close range, the Sturmtiger was equipped with an MG-34 machine gun mounted in the front hull. This weapon was operated by the loader when he wasn't needed for his primary duties. The machine gun provided defense against infantry attacks, allowing the crew to repel enemy soldiers who might try to approach the vehicle to plant explosives or attack the tracks and running gear. The crew itself consisted of 5 to 7 men, depending on the source and the specific operational configuration. The core crew included the commander, the driver, the gunner, and the loader. Additional crew members could include a radio operator and assistant loaders, given the difficulty of handling the massive ammunition. Inside the vehicle, the crew worked in cramped conditions, despite the Sturmtiger's large size. The massive ammunition took up significant internal space, and the loading mechanism required substantial room to operate. Visibility was limited due to the casemate design, which meant the crew had to rely on vision ports and periscopes rather than the 360-degree visibility offered by a rotating turret. Despite these internal limitations, the crew benefited from the psychological security of knowing they were operating one of the most heavily protected vehicles on the battlefield. Few weapons could threaten them, and this confidence allowed them to operate in environments where other vehicles would be quickly destroyed. The Sturmtiger's first taste of combat came not in the massive set-piece battles that characterized much of World War II, but in the brutal urban warfare of the Warsaw Uprising in August and September of 1944. The Warsaw Uprising was a desperate attempt by the Polish resistance to liberate the city before Soviet forces arrived. The Polish Home Army, numbering around 40,000 fighters, rose up against the German occupation on August 1, 1944, hoping to establish an independent Polish government before the Soviets could impose communist rule. The German response was swift and brutal. SS and Wehrmacht units were ordered to suppress the uprising with maximum force. The fighting quickly devolved into a vicious street-by-street, building-by-building battle that would last for 63 days and result in the deaths of over 200,000 people, mostly civilians. For the Germans, Warsaw presented a significant tactical challenge. The Polish resistance had fortified buildings throughout the city, creating a network of strong points that were difficult to assault with conventional infantry tactics. Standard artillery was often ineffective because the Polish fighters would simply move to the basements or lower floors of the heavily constructed buildings, where they were protected from all but direct hits. This was exactly the scenario for which the Sturmtiger had been designed. In September 1944, as production was just beginning, 2 prototype Sturmtigers were rushed to Warsaw to participate in the suppression of the uprising. These vehicles, still technically in the testing phase, were about to prove their devastating capabilities in real combat conditions. The impact was immediate and terrifying. The Sturmtiger could approach fortified buildings with virtual impunity. Polish resistance fighters, armed primarily with small arms, captured weapons, and limited anti-tank capabilities, had no effective way to stop the armored behemoths. Even their most powerful captured anti-tank weapons bounced harmlessly off the Sturmtiger's thick armor. When a Sturmtiger targeted a building, the result was catastrophic. A single 380mm rocket-propelled shell could demolish even the most robust structures. Multi-story buildings that had withstood days of conventional artillery bombardment would simply collapse after a direct hit from a Sturmtiger. The massive explosive force would blow out supporting walls and columns, causing the entire structure to pancake down on itself. Survivors described the experience as apocalyptic. The sound of the Sturmtiger firing was distinctive, a deep, thunderous boom that echoed through the city streets. The ground would shake. Then, seconds later, the targeted building would simply disintegrate in a massive explosion that sent debris flying in all directions and created a towering column of dust and smoke. For the Polish resistance fighters sheltering in these buildings, there was no defense. They could only evacuate and hope to escape before the Sturmtiger fired. The psychological impact was enormous. Positions that fighters had thought were safe, buildings with thick walls and deep basements that had protected them from conventional weapons, were suddenly death traps. The Germans used the 2 Sturmtigers systematically, supporting their infantry as they cleared the city district by district. The assault guns would move up to a fortified position, fire a single devastating shot, and then the infantry would move in to clear the rubble and capture any survivors. It was brutally effective. By the time the Warsaw Uprising was finally crushed on October 2, 1944, much of the city lay in ruins. The 2 Sturmtigers had played a significant role in that destruction. German after-action reports noted that the vehicles had performed admirably, exceeding expectations in their primary role of destroying fortified positions in urban terrain. The success in Warsaw validated the Sturmtiger concept. Here, finally, was proof that the vehicle could deliver on its promise. Orders were given to accelerate production and to form dedicated Sturmtiger companies that could be deployed wherever urban combat threatened to bog down German forces. But Warsaw also revealed the limitations that would plague the Sturmtiger throughout its short operational life. The vehicle's limited ammunition capacity meant they were dependent on supply lines to bring forward more rounds. The distinctive firing signature made them priority targets for any Allied artillery or air power in the area, and the cumbersome reloading process meant they could not provide sustained fire support. Most significantly, Warsaw demonstrated that the Sturmtiger was fundamentally an offensive weapon. It excelled when used to support advancing infantry, demolishing defensive positions ahead of the attack. But by late 1944, Germany was increasingly fighting a defensive war. The scenarios for which the Sturmtiger had been designed, advancing through enemy cities and fortifications, were becoming rare. Instead, German forces found themselves desperately trying to hold defensive positions against overwhelming Allied attacks. The question now was whether the Sturmtiger could adapt to this new reality, or whether it would remain an impressive solution to a problem that no longer existed. The Sturmtiger's most famous engagement, though ultimately a failure, came during the Battle of Remagen in March 1945. This battle would showcase both the potential and the fundamental limitations of the Sturmtiger concept. By March 1945, the war was clearly lost for Germany. Allied forces had broken through the German border defenses and were pushing deep into the heart of the Reich. The Rhine River represented the last major natural barrier between the Allies and the German heartland. If the Allies could capture a bridge across the Rhine intact, they could pour forces across and accelerate the final collapse of Nazi Germany. On March 7, 1945, elements of the U.S. 9th Armored Division reached the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen. To their amazement, the bridge was still standing. The Germans had failed to destroy it, and American forces quickly secured a bridgehead on the eastern bank. This was a disaster for the German defense, creating a gap in their lines that threatened to unravel their entire position along the Rhine. The German High Command reacted with panic. Orders went out to destroy the bridge at all costs. Every available weapon was thrown at the American positions. Artillery bombarded the bridge day and night. The Luftwaffe, by this point almost non-existent, scraped together what few aircraft they could find for bombing runs. And the Kriegsmarine deployed swimmers with explosives in desperate attempts to demolish the span. Among the forces rushed to Remagen were 7 Sturmtigers, representing a significant portion of the total number ever produced. The plan was simple: use the Sturmtiger's massive firepower to demolish the bridge from a distance, cutting off the American forces on the eastern bank and restoring the Rhine defense line. The Sturmtigers were positioned at various points with line of sight to the bridge. The crews carefully calculated distances and angles. This was exactly the kind of mission for which the vehicle had been designed, destroying a hardened target from medium range. The bridge, made of reinforced steel and concrete, should have been an ideal target for the Sturmtiger's devastating 380mm shells. But when the Sturmtigers opened fire, a critical flaw in the weapon system became apparent. The guns were simply not accurate enough for precision targeting at range. The stubby barrel and the 2-stage rocket propulsion system, which worked adequately for hitting large targets like buildings at close range, proved inadequate for hitting a relatively narrow bridge at distance. Round after round was fired. Each shot would produce the distinctive massive explosion and plume of smoke, but the shells would fall short, overshoot, or impact to one side or the other of the bridge. The Americans, watching from their positions, must have been both terrified by the massive explosions and relieved that none of the shells were finding their mark. The Sturmtigers expended their limited ammunition trying to hit the bridge, but ultimately failed in their mission. The Ludendorff Bridge would eventually collapse on March 17th, but this was due to accumulated damage from conventional artillery and American military traffic, not from the Sturmtiger attacks. However, during the Battle of Remagen, one Sturmtiger apparently achieved an extraordinary feat that has become legendary, though it remains controversial and disputed to this day. According to German records, a Sturmtiger operating near the village of Düren, several kilometers from the bridge itself, fired a single shell that struck a concentration of American Sherman tanks. The shell allegedly destroyed or disabled 3 Sherman tanks with that single shot. If true, this would be an incredible demonstration of the Sturmtiger's power. The massive explosive force of a 380mm shell could certainly destroy multiple vehicles if they were close together. The blast radius and fragmentation pattern would be devastating to any unarmored or lightly armored targets within dozens of meters. However, American records from the battle make no mention of this incident. No after-action reports describe losing 3 tanks to a single shell. This has led many historians to question whether the incident actually occurred or whether it was exaggerated German propaganda designed to boost morale during the desperate final weeks of the war. The truth may never be fully known. German record-keeping in the chaotic final weeks of the war was often incomplete or inaccurate. American records, while generally more reliable, might not have correctly identified the weapon that caused the damage or might have attributed losses to other causes. It's also possible that the incident occurred but was misreported, perhaps with damage to 3 tanks being conflated into destruction of 3 tanks. What is not in dispute is that the Sturmtiger had the theoretical capability to achieve such a feat. A direct hit, or even a near miss with an 800-pound high-explosive warhead, would absolutely be capable of destroying multiple tanks. The blast wave alone would be sufficient to cause catastrophic damage to vehicles within the kill radius. The Battle of Remagen encapsulated the Sturmtiger's legacy: enormous potential, limited by practical shortcomings and deployed too late to make a difference. By March 1945, Germany had already lost the war. No wonder weapon, no matter how powerful, could change that fundamental reality. The story of the Sturmtiger is ultimately a story of missed potential and tragic timing. Here was a weapon system that, in the right circumstances and with proper support, could have been truly devastating. But it arrived at a point in the war when Germany could no longer use it effectively. Imagine if the Sturmtiger had been available in significant numbers in 1942 or early 1943, when Germany was still on the offensive. During the brutal house-to-house fighting in Stalingrad, Sturmtigers could have been game-changers, demolishing the fortified buildings that Soviet defenders used so effectively. During the siege of Leningrad, they could have supported German attempts to break into the city. In the urban battles across the Eastern Front, these vehicles might have provided the critical edge that German forces needed. But the reality was that the Sturmtiger didn't enter production until September 1944, when Germany was already fighting a defensive war on all fronts. The vehicle had been designed for offensive operations, for supporting infantry as they advanced through fortified enemy positions. This was no longer the war Germany was fighting. Instead, German forces were desperately trying to hold defensive lines against overwhelming Allied superiority in numbers, air power, and resources. In a defensive role, the Sturmtiger's limitations became critical weaknesses. Its low rate of fire meant it couldn't provide sustained defensive fire. Its limited ammunition capacity meant it would quickly run out of shells in any prolonged engagement. Its distinctive firing signature made it a priority target for Allied airstrikes and artillery. The production numbers tell their own story. Only 18 Sturmtigers were ever built. This tiny number meant the vehicle could never have a strategic impact on the war. They were too few, spread too thin across too many fronts, to make a difference in the outcome. Compare this to the thousands of Sherman tanks produced by the United States, or the tens of thousands of T-34s produced by the Soviet Union, and the scale of the disparity becomes clear. German resources, which by late 1944 were increasingly stretched to the breaking point, might have been better used producing more conventional weapons. The specialized ammunition for the Sturmtiger required manufacturing capacity that could have been used for more versatile conventional artillery shells. This gets at a broader issue with German late-war weapons development. The Nazi regime had a tendency to pursue technologically impressive but ultimately impractical wonder weapons rather than focusing on producing adequate quantities of reliable, proven equipment. The Sturmtiger, like the Mao's super heavy tank, the V-2 rocket, and various other advanced projects, represented enormous investments of resources that yielded minimal practical military benefit. Yet, despite all these criticisms, it's important to recognize what an impressive achievement the Sturmtiger represented. German engineers had created a weapon that was genuinely revolutionary in concept and execution. The Allied reaction to the Sturmtiger is perhaps the best testament to its capabilities. When intelligence reports confirmed that Sturmtigers were operating in an area, Allied commanders took the threat seriously. Tactics were developed specifically for dealing with these vehicles. Bypass them if possible, call in airstrikes if necessary, but avoid direct engagement with ground forces. The fact that Allied forces, which by 1944 had overwhelming superiority in almost every category, felt the need to avoid engaging this rare vehicle speaks volumes about how dangerous it was perceived to be. After the war, several Sturmtigers were captured intact by Allied forces. These vehicles were thoroughly studied and tested. American and British engineers examined the vehicles with great interest, analyzing the armor protection, the weapon system, and the overall design. The general consensus was that the Sturmtiger was an impressive piece of engineering that represented a valid solution to a specific tactical problem, but that its operational limitations would have prevented it from being truly effective even if it had been available in larger numbers earlier in the war. Today, only a handful of Sturmtigers survive in museums around the world. These massive vehicles stand as monuments to German engineering ambition, technological innovation, and the desperate final attempts to turn the tide of a war that was already lost. The most complete example resides at the Deutsches Panzer Museum in Münster, Germany. This vehicle, carefully restored and preserved, allows visitors to truly appreciate the scale and presence of the Sturmtiger. Standing next to this 65-ton behemoth, with its massive rocket launcher and thick armor plating, it's easy to understand why Allied soldiers found it so intimidating. The Sturmtiger's legacy extends beyond its limited combat service. It represents an extreme point in the evolution of armored warfare, a vehicle designed for a specific purpose and pushed to the limits of what was practically possible with 1940s technology. If you enjoyed this deep dive into one of World War II's most unique armored vehicles, please like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell for more military history content. Let me know in the comments what other vehicles or battles you'd like to see covered. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.